Airport Horror. Written by Kanefan701. Read and adapted for audio by TARDIS9. The Fat Controller's engines were all excited to hear that Percy was returning to the railway in 7 days. Percy's overhaul was almost completed. All that was left was his reassembly. Thomas was excited that he would soon be reunited with his longtime friend, as were Emily and Toby. Even Gordon, Henry and James admitted to missing the little green engine, despite the fact that Percy was a pain in the boiler to them. The summer season had been taking its toll on the engines, with lots of people visiting the island. Several weeks had passed since the ghosts of Flights 1205 and 686 were mentioned. Jeremy and his pilots never talked about it, and kept the tragic story locked deep in their thoughts. Sodor Airport was getting to be much busier than ever, and it was putting heavy strains on the staff and authorities. Jeremy was feeling very tired. He had been hauling a series of short flights back and forth from Sodor to London and to Northern Ireland. One day, while undergoing a bead check, inspectors and mechanics found that Jeremy had got a series of metal fatigue cracks, which had developed during his flight service over the summer. This meant that Jeremy had to be taken out of service and to undergo a more serious maintenance. To help out with the increasing passengers visiting Sodor, the airport needed more aircraft. While smaller planes proved to be helpful, the more bigger ones, such as the Boeing 777 and MD-11, were much more useful. One evening, just 4 days before Percy was due to return, Molly was heading off to the airport station with some empty vans to pick up some cargo that had been delivered from the USA. The airport itself was very quiet, since many of the planes had left. Only 5 of them were still present, but they were not much of a problem to deal with for the air traffic controllers in the control tower. Up in the sky, 2 Boeing 737s, one from American Airlines and the other from British Airways, were awaiting permission to land after they had been diverted from their original flight path. As Molly arrived at the station, darkness was beginning to fall. The station staff began to load up the train. While this was going on, Molly watched the 2 planes circling the airport. She saw the British Airways Boeing 737 coming into land first, before the American Airlines one came in 10 minutes later. While this was going on, Molly's driver and fireman had a talk with the station master about what the cargo was. She looked to her left and saw what looked to be a man in his mid-60s wearing a zoot suit, walking close by Jeremy's hangar. He stood at the entranceway, with his head low, his hat covering his eyes. Then he slowly pulled out a Browning high-power practical handgun and entered the hangar. Seconds later, the sound of him opening fire rang out. Molly screamed in horror. Her driver, fireman, the station master and the staff came running over to her. "What's the matter, Molly?" asked the driver. "I just saw a man open fire in Jeremy's hangar!" Molly wailed, still in horror. "What do you mean, opening fire?" said the fireman. "We heard nothing." "But I swear I did!" cried Molly. "I was not seeing or hearing things." The station master turned his head, and then he almost gasped, but managed to control himself. He saw the mysterious man now walking away from Jeremy's hangar and then vanishing behind the building. "I think Molly's right," he said. "I too just saw the man, but I didn't get a good look at his face." Everyone else scratched their heads in confusion. Molly was still in a state of horror and remained that way when she returned home. The next day, Molly told Emily and Rosie. They believed her story and were spooked from their boilers to their wheels. Soon the story spread down the line, but most of the engines did not believe it. The subject was soon forgotten, but Molly would not stop talking about it, for it was playing on her mind so much. What I saw was real, she said to herself. Why can't the other engines believe me? That afternoon, Molly was taking a tourist train. She arrived at Bluffs Cove Station, where Thomas was hauling some trucks into a siding. Thomas saw the expression on her face.
"What's the matter, Molly?"
he asked her.
"You look like you've seen a ghost."
It happened last night, Molly replied. What I saw was real. This mysterious man just walked into Jeremy's hangar, then shot the workers inside and then came out walking away as if nothing had happened. Thomas was intrigued by the subject, but not convinced. I'm sure it's not a ghost, Molly said.
Your mind must have played a trick on you, Thomas said. Surely no one would do that while being seen.
Thomas, mark my words, Molly replied. This man is cold and ruthless. He might even target one of us or even our drivers and firemen. Thomas dismissed this and went about his work. That evening, he was ordered to take the mail train. This was mostly Percy's favourite job, but he was still scheduled to return in a few days, so Thomas had been doing this during his absence. While Thomas went to deliver or pick up mail from all the stations, he had to go to Sodor Airport. A FedEx Express MD-11 was there, unloading its cargo hold where the ground crew were removing mail parcels and taking them to the station for Thomas to pick up. However, the weather changed rapidly. A heavy haze and mist arose. It was dark by the time Thomas arrived.
Oh boy, he sighed. It's gotten pretty misty over here.
Yes, it has, added the driver. One of the worst mists I've ever seen. While the station staff helped out with the airport ground crew in loading the mail parcels into the mail vans, the mist became thicker. Thomas looked around. Despite the fact that the airport lights were on at full glow, it looked a bit spooky, and he felt a little nervous. Molly's story began to play on his mind. Just then Henry came rocketing by with the express, whistling long and loudly. This almost made Thomas jump off the rails.
Being scared at Henry, Thomas said to himself. How silly I am.
But then he could hear the sound of footsteps. It got louder and louder until suddenly a mysterious figure emerged from the mist. It was the man, wearing his zoot suit, carrying his handgun in his right hand. He gave a cold stare at Thomas as he loaded his gun.
What are you gonna do? Thomas said, shaking in fear. You're not gonna shoot me, are you?
The man didn't respond. He continued to stare coldly at the blue tank engine. Then he raised his gun, aiming it at him. Thomas shut his eyes tightly in fright.
Please, no, don't! He wailed in alarm, almost close to tears.
A few seconds passed, and then silence fell. Thomas cautiously opened his eyes. No one was there. The mysterious man had vanished. The following morning, Thomas was returning home, very tired, but still in a state of fright from his experience last night. He arrived at Maythwaite Station, where Molly was hauling a goods train. She could already see that he had gone through the same experience that she had had several days before. So I was right, she thought to herself. That mysterious man is real. Later that day at the shunting yard, Thomas spoke to Molly about last night. She was amazed, but mostly sorry for the little blue engine. Just then, Edward puffed in.
"I say, you two both look like you've seen a ghost or something,"
he said.
"Molly told me about this mysterious man who keeps wandering around Sodor Airport, and he carries a gun,"
Thomas said to the old engine.
"Perhaps you might know who he is."
It took a while, but soon the subject rang a bell in Edward's smokebox.
"It seems that you and Molly have come across the ghost of Tony Walkman,"
he said.
"My driver told me all about him." "Who's Tony Walkman?"
Molly asked. Edward took a deep breath and began to tell his story.
"It began in 1963, where the age of steam was beginning to withdraw. Tony Walkman and his wife, Jessica Walkman, had lived in Britain since they were children. Both their parents had died in tragic accidents when they were young. Tony and Jessica had a strong friendship bond and later married in 1965. For their honeymoon, they went to Sodor and later started to live there and begin a new life. Tony got a job as a doctor, while Jessica became a nursery teacher. Throughout most of their lives as a married couple, they enjoyed life and had children and raised them so well. Tony and Jessica named their children after them. It all seems that the family would have no problems. Unfortunately, that would not be true. In 2007, Tony and Jessica found out that their son had been unfaithful to them. But they soon discovered even more bad news about him. He had admitted into abusing his own sister. The son was soon arrested for his crime, but he had threatened to murder his own parents once he was released. However, Tony Walkman would see to it that his threat was not carried out. His son broke out of jail and ran away, stealing a Browning high-power practical handgun, as well as a car. While driving the stolen vehicle, he saw his family's car heading towards Sodor Airport because they were attempting to leave Sodor and move back to Britain. He followed them and tracked their every move and waited for the right moment to attack. However, his plan backfired, for Tony Walkman had been fully aware of his son's intentions and had armed himself with a handgun of his own, the same type as his son's. A shooting battle erupted between father and son, and sadly some lives were lost in the shootout. Tony Walkman protected his wife and daughter from his evil son as the battle raged until the Sodor unit squad arrived to end the fight. But this would end in tragedy. The Sodor unit shot both father and son, both of them dying instantly from their shot wounds. The case into the shooting took over 9 months to solve, and investigators concluded that it was a case of homicide and revenge. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Tony Walkman was laid to rest in a cemetery. His wife, Jessica, would later die from cancer, and their daughter, Jessica Jr., would marry a man she had known since her high school years and have children of her own. They currently live here on Sodor, in the same house which her parents moved into years ago. The story is mostly forgotten, but it has been said that Tony Walkman's spirit can be seen wandering about at the airport, armed with his Browning high-power practical handgun, searching for his betrayed son so that he could finish off what they started. But they'll never find him.
Thomas and Molly were left speechless.
"It's rather sad to know," Edward said with a sigh. "A son's rage and fury to get back at his own family, causing the lives of both himself and his father to be lost. My driver at one point mentioned he knew Tony Walkman and his wife, and never told me that until a few years after the tragedy."
Thomas and Molly looked at each other. Molly was very close to crying, but she managed to hold back her tears. Thomas sighed and looked down at his buffers.
So I take it that the ghost of Tony Walkman poses no threat to us? He asked. Oh, no, not at all, Edward said. I remember at one time that I came across him, and he mistakenly thought that my driver was his son and took aim at him. But he soon saw that my driver was not him and he walked away. From time to time, Tony thinks that his son will come out and ambush him, but only to find out that it's us steam engines.
Both Thomas and Molly sighed with relief. 2 days later, Percy the small green engine made his successful return, looking as good as new and very smart. He was greeted by all of his friends and even had a party held in his honour. Thomas was delighted to be reunited with him, for he felt much better after what he had been through. A few weeks would pass since the story of Tony Walkman was told to them, but in the back of Thomas and Molly's minds, they knew that one of these days, Tony's spirit would soon find peace and put an end to his haunting of Sodor Airport.